Have you ever been called difficult? Too sensitive, too intense, too unpredictable? They say you're hard to work with, that you don't follow the rules, that you complicate simple things. They want you to be more practical, more consistent, more like everyone else. And they make it sound like your creativity is a character flaw that needs to be fixed. But what if I told you that Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, discovered that creative people aren't difficult despite their creativity? They're labeled difficult because of it. What if the traits that make you hard to deal with are the same traits that make you capable of original thought? What if society calls you difficult simply because you refuse to be ordinary? Jung understood something profound. He said, "The creative mind plays with the objects it loves." But what he didn't say is that this play looks like chaos to people who need order. Your creative process threatens their need for predictability. Your refusal to fit into neat categories disturbs their carefully organized world. You've felt this your entire life. The teacher who said you asked too many questions. The boss who called you inflexible because you challenged the standard approach. The friends who labeled you dramatic because you feel things deeply. The family members who wished you were more normal, more practical, more easy. But Jung knew that creative people aren't broken versions of normal people. They're accessing something deeper, something the conformist mind can't reach. And that's exactly why they're called difficult. Because creativity doesn't conform. It disrupts. It questions. It transforms. And transformation is always uncomfortable for those who prefer things to stay the same. Today, we're going to reveal why creative people are systematically labeled as difficult. Why your intensity isn't a problem, it's the source of your power. Why the traits that make you too much for some people are precisely what the world needs. And why Jung believed that the creative personality isn't just different, it's psychologically necessary for human evolution. If you've ever been made to feel like your creativity is a burden rather than a gift, stay with me. Because what comes next will change how you see yourself forever. Jung observed something that will validate your entire experience. He said, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct." Think about that. Creativity doesn't come from logical, orderly thinking. It comes from play, from experimentation, from breaking rules to see what happens. But watch what society does with this. From childhood, you're taught that play is waste. That experimentation without guaranteed results is irresponsible. That breaking rules, even arbitrary ones, is defiance. The entire system is designed to eliminate the play instinct, to turn creative children into compliant adults. And when you refuse to eliminate it, when you insist on playing with ideas, experimenting with possibilities, breaking rules that don't serve creativity, you're labeled difficult, oppositional, a problem that needs to be managed. This isn't accidental. Jung understood that society needs conformity to function. It needs people who follow instructions, who accept standard procedures, who don't question why things are done a certain way. The system runs on predictability, and creative people are fundamentally unpredictable. You don't work in straight lines. Your process looks chaotic from the outside because it is chaotic. You start projects and abandon them. You become obsessed with ideas and then move on. You have bursts of intense productivity followed by periods of apparent inactivity. To the orderly mind, this looks like lack of discipline, like you can't commit, like you're unreliable. But Jung would say you're not undisciplined. You're following a different kind of discipline. The discipline of the creative process itself, which has its own rhythm, its own requirements, its own timeline, that has nothing to do with external schedules and expectations. The creative mind operates in what Jung called active imagination. You live partially in the world of forms and possibilities, not just the world of concrete reality. You see what could be, not just what is. And this requires you to hold multiple contradictions simultaneously, to embrace uncertainty, to tolerate ambiguity. This is exhausting for people who need certainty. They want clear answers, defined roles, predictable outcomes. When you say it depends, or I need to explore this more, or I'm not sure yet, they hear incompetence, indecision, difficulty. But you're not indecisive. You're thorough. You're exploring the full possibility space before committing to a direction. And that exploration, that play with multiple options, that's where creativity lives. If you're feeling this, if something in you is recognizing itself, stay with me. We're about to go deeper into what Jung discovered about the creative personality and why it threatens the status quo so profoundly. Jung made a crucial observation about creative people. He said, "In the creative person, there is a need to make conscious what was previously unconscious." This is the key. Creative people are constantly bringing the unconscious into consciousness, taking vague feelings and making them concrete, transforming invisible patterns into visible forms. This is psychological work. Deep, difficult, necessary psychological work. And it requires traits that look like problems to people who aren't doing this work. You need solitude to access the unconscious, so they call you antisocial. You need intense focus when inspiration strikes, so they call you obsessive. You need to follow the creative impulse even when it's inconvenient, so they call you selfish. You need to question established methods, so they call you difficult. But every one of these difficult traits is actually a requirement for creativity. You can't access the unconscious in constant social stimulation. You can't develop ideas without intense focus. You can't follow creative impulses while constantly accommodating others' schedules. You can't innovate while blindly following established methods. Jung understood this perfectly. He wrote about what he called creative illness, periods where creative people withdraw from normal life and appear to be struggling. But they're not sick. They're gestating. They're allowing unconscious material to rise to the surface. They're in the chaos that precedes creation. And society has no patience for this. Society wants productivity on a schedule, consistent output, reliable performance. When you need to withdraw, when you can't produce on demand, when you're in the messy middle of the creative process, you're failing to meet expectations. You're being difficult. But the alternative is to shut down your creativity entirely, to ignore the unconscious material trying to emerge, to force yourself into a rhythm that serves everyone else, but destroys your creative capacity. And Jung was clear about what happens when creative people, they don't become easier. They become depressed, anxious, physically ill. Because you're not just suppressing inconvenient behaviors, you're suppressing your essential nature. The pattern reveals itself clearly. Every difficult trait of creative people serves a psychological function. Your sensitivity, that's heightened perception. You notice what others miss. Your intensity, that's depth of engagement. You don't do things halfway. Your mood variability, that's responsiveness to creative flow. You're not stable because you're alive to possibility. Your resistance to authority, that's intellectual independence. You don't accept ideas just because someone in power said them. Your boundary issues around your creative time, that's self-protection. You're guarding the conditions that allow creativity to emerge. Your difficulty with small talk, that's a preference for meaningful exchange. You're not interested in performing social niceties while ignoring real communication. Jung saw all of this. He recognized that creative people aren't poorly socialized versions of normal people. They're differently organized. Their priorities are internal rather than external. Their satisfaction comes from creating rather than from social approval. Their energy goes into making rather than into maintaining appearances. And this fundamentally threatens people whose entire identity is built on social approval and external validation. When you don't care about the same things they care about, when you're not motivated by the same rewards, when you're willing to be unpopular in service of your creative work, you're exposing that their values are arbitrary, that there are other ways to live. They can't admit this, so they call you difficult. They frame your difference as deficiency. They suggest you need to change, to grow up, to learn to compromise. But what they're really asking is for you to stop being creative so they can stop feeling uncomfortable. Write this down. Say it to yourself. I'm not difficult. I'm creative in a world that prefers conformity. Because that's the truth Jung spent his career defending. Now Jung's concept of individuation becomes crucial. Individuation is the process of becoming your true self. Not the self society wants you to be. Not the persona you wear to fit in. But your authentic, whole, integrated self. And for creative people, individuation always involves conflict. Because your true self is creative. And the creative self doesn't fit into conventional categories. It doesn't want conventional success. It doesn't follow conventional timelines. It doesn't value conventional achievements. This creates what Jung called the tension of opposites. On one side, your creative nature pulling you toward authenticity, depth, meaning. On the other side, social pressure pulling you toward conformity, surface, acceptance, and you're caught in the middle, feeling torn between being true to yourself and being acceptable to others. Most people resolve this tension by choosing conformity. They suppress their creative impulses. They fit in. They become easy, predictable, manageable, and they spend the rest of their lives with a vague sense of having betrayed something important. Jung called this living an unlived life. But you haven't done this. You've chosen authenticity even though it's harder, even though it makes you difficult in other people's eyes, even though it costs you socially. And Jung would say this choice, this commitment to your creative nature despite the cost, this is courage. Not the courage of grand dramatic gestures, the courage of daily defiance, of continuing to create when people tell you to stop, of protecting your creative process when people call you selfish, of honoring your need for depth when people want you to stay on the surface. Consider Jung's insight. Creative people access the collective unconscious, the reservoir of universal human experience. When you create, you're not just expressing personal preferences. You're channeling archetypal energies, ancient patterns, the shared psychological inheritance of humanity. This is why your creative work often surprises even you. Why you create things and wonder, where did this come from? It came from layers deeper than your conscious mind, from the collective unconscious that you access because you're willing to descend into psychological depths that most people avoid. But accessing these depths requires you to be different. You can't reach the collective unconscious while staying safely on the surface. You can't channel archetypal energies while maintaining conventional boundaries. You can't bring back psychological treasure while fitting perfectly into normal life. The creative person is always partly a stranger to normal life, always slightly out of sync with conventional rhythm, always appearing somewhat odd to people who live entirely on the surface. This isn't a problem to be fixed. It's the price and the privilege of doing creative work that matters. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For creative people, this privilege comes with the label difficult. But that label says more about the labeler than about you. It says they're uncomfortable with authenticity, threatened by depth, disturbed by anyone who won't pretend that surface life is enough. Your difficulty is their discomfort reflected back at you, and recognizing this changes everything. You're not the problem. You're the mirror showing them what they've suppressed in themselves. If you're feeling this truth, if it's resonating somewhere deep, write this in the comments. My creativity is not a character flaw. Say it like a declaration. Because it is. Watch what happens in any creative field. The most innovative work always comes from people considered difficult. The breakthrough ideas come from people who wouldn't stop questioning. The transformative art comes from people who refuse to create what was expected. Steve Jobs was notoriously difficult. So was Picasso. And Beethoven, and Virginia Woolf, and David Bowie, and Maya Angelou. The list goes on. Every creative person who actually changed their field was considered difficult by their contemporaries because they had to be difficult. Difficulty was the price of refusing to make conventional work. They couldn't create what they created while being easy, while accommodating everyone's comfort, while following all the rules, while making everyone around them feel safe and validated. Their creative vision required them to be absolutely committed to it, even when that commitment made them hard to work with, hard to understand, hard to categorize. And here's what's interesting. After they're dead, after their difficult personalities can't bother anyone anymore, we celebrate their work. We call them geniuses. We study their methods. We wish we had more people like them. But while they're alive, while their difficulty is still inconveniencing people, we try to make them normal. We try to fix them. We call them difficult like it's a diagnosis. Jung understood this pattern. He saw that creative people are only appreciated posthumously because only then can society consume their creativity without having to deal with their personality. Only then can we take what they made without having to accommodate who they were. But you're alive now. Your creativity is happening now. And the people around you have to deal with the full package, the brilliant work and the difficult personality, the inconvenient creative process and the incredible results, the social oddness and the psychological depth. Some people can't handle this. They want the creativity without the difficult parts. They want you to produce on demand without needing solitude, to have brilliant ideas without the chaotic exploration, to make meaningful work without the intense emotions, to be creative in a convenient, manageable, predictable way. But that's not how creativity works. Jung was clear about this. Creativity is a whole system phenomenon. You can't compartmentalize it. You can't be creative at your desk and conventional everywhere else. Your creative nature affects everything. How you think, how you feel, how you relate to people, how you structure your time, how you respond to rules and authority and social expectations. This is why trying to be less difficult means being less creative. The traits are inseparable. Your sensitivity feeds your creativity. Your intensity deepens your work. Your unpredictability allows for spontaneous innovation. Your resistance to authority protects your creative independence. Your difficulty is not separate from your creativity. It's part of the same psychological structure. So when someone asks you to be less difficult, they're asking you to be less creative. They might not realize that's what they're asking. They think you can keep the good parts and eliminate the challenging parts. But Jung knew better. The challenging parts aren't bugs in your personality. They're features of your creative nature. Now we reach the core of Jung's understanding. He believed that creative people serve a psychological function for society. You're not just making things for entertainment or decoration. You're doing necessary psychological work on behalf of the collective. When you bring unconscious material into consciousness through your creative work, you're making visible what everyone feels but can't articulate. When you challenge conventions through your art, you're questioning assumptions that everyone's accepted without examination. When you create something genuinely new, You're expanding what's possible for everyone. This is sacred work. Ancient cultures understood this. They honored their artists, their storytellers, their visionaries. They recognized that creative people were essential to the tribe's psychological health. They might be difficult to live with, but they were too valuable to suppress. Modern society has forgotten this. We treat creativity as a hobby, as entertainment, as something nice to have, but not essential. And we treat creative people as problems to be managed rather than treasures to be protected. We want your output, but not your process. Your product, but not your personality. Your gifts, but not your needs. This is backwards. Jung would say that creative people should be given whatever they need to do their work, not because they're special or superior, but because their work serves everyone. When you create something true, something that resonates with psychological depth, it doesn't just benefit you, it helps others access their own unconscious. It gives language to experiences that were wordless. It makes visible what was hidden. This is why people cry at movies that capture something real. Why they're transformed by books that speak psychological truth. Why they return again and again to art that touches something deep. They're not just being entertained. They're being given access to parts of themselves that they couldn't reach alone. And you did that. Your difficult creative process, your inconvenient needs, your refusal to compromise your vision, all of that served this larger purpose. You were difficult in service of something more important than being easy. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." Creative people need different conditions than conventional people, different rhythms, different environments, different amounts of solitude and stimulation and freedom and structure. There's no moral judgment in this. You're not better than conventional people. You're different, and that difference requires different conditions. When society tries to force you into conditions that work for conventional people, you suffer. And your creativity suffers. And ultimately, everyone suffers because the creative work you could have done doesn't get made. So protecting your difficulty is actually protecting your creativity. And protecting your creativity is protecting your ability to serve the deeper psychological needs of the collective. This reframes everything. You're not being selfish when you guard your creative process. You're being responsible. You're protecting something that matters more than other people's comfort. Stay with us if you want to keep exploring what it means to be creative in a world that prefers conformity. Subscribe not because we'll make you easier, but because we'll help you understand why your difficulty is necessary. We're here, not to fix you, but to validate you. Here's the final truth Jung understood about creative people. You're not difficult because something's wrong with you. You're difficult because something's right with you. Your difficulty is resistance. Resistance to being less than you are. Resistance to making your work smaller to fit other people's comfort. Resistance to living an unlived life. This resistance looks like stubbornness, like inflexibility, like you not being a team player. But it's actually integrity. It's you knowing at a deep level that compromising your creative nature means betraying yourself. And you won't do it, even when it would be easier, even when it would make people like you more, even when it would solve immediate problems. Jung called this the moral duty to be oneself. For creative people, this duty often conflicts with the social expectation to be easy. And when that conflict arises, you choose yourself. You choose your creative nature. You choose difficulty over betrayal. This is not selfishness. This is self-preservation. Because you know what happens when creative people try to be normal. They don't become happy normal people. They become depressed creative people, anxious creative people, physically ill creative people. because you can't cut off parts of yourself without consequences. Your sensitivity doesn't disappear when you pretend not to notice things. It turns into anxiety. Your intensity doesn't vanish when you tone it down. It turns into depression. Your creative unpredictability doesn't resolve when you force routine. It turns into physical symptoms. Your body rebels against the betrayal. So your difficulty is actually self-care. It's you refusing to destroy yourself to make others comfortable. And Jung would say this refusal is not just personally healthy, it's psychologically necessary. Because the world needs what you make, needs the psychological work you do, needs the depth you access, needs the truth you tell through your creative work. When you compromise your creative nature to be easy, you're not just hurting yourself. You're depriving the collective of the gifts only you can give. Because your particular creative vision, shaped by your particular psychological makeup, filtered through your particular difficulty, that combination is unique. No one else will make what you make. No one else will access what you access. No one else will say what you say. This is why Jung believed creative people must protect their difficulty, not celebrate it arrogantly, not wield it as a weapon, but protect it as a necessary condition for doing your work, because your work matters. Even when it's hard, even when people don't understand it, even when it doesn't fit into conventional categories of success. So take a breath. Notice that you're creative right now. Notice that your difficulty isn't separate from that creativity. Notice that in this moment, accepting your full nature, difficult parts and all, you're more whole than you ever are when pretending to be easy. This is the truth conventional people ignore. That creativity requires the full person. All the intensity and sensitivity and unpredictability and resistance, all the traits they call difficult, all the qualities they wish you'd eliminate. You are creative. You are difficult. These are not two separate facts about you. They're one truth expressed in different ways. And that truth doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be honored. Welcome home.